The gavel hadn't even settled before Arthur Kellerman was on his feet. "Your Honor, get him out of here, now. A child cannot stand for a felony hearing." Judge Richard Harrington didn't blink. 22 years on the bench had taught him that panic in a courtroom usually meant someone was about to be proven wrong. "Then tell me, counselor," he said, "why there's an 8-year-old boy standing where your objection should be aimed instead." "My name is Zion Carter." The boy's voice didn't shake. "I'm 8 years old. The man at that table is my father. And I'm here because every lawyer he could afford already gave up on him." "Young man, do you understand what a court of law is?" "Yes, sir. I've read his case file 11 times. And you believe you can succeed where a trained attorney couldn't?" "No, sir." He held the judge's eyes. "I believe I can ask the one question nobody bothered to ask. That's all I need." "Your Honor, the state's time is valuable," Kellerman cut in. "So is my father's freedom, sir." Nobody in that gallery breathed for a second. Have you ever noticed how it's usually the person nobody expects who ends up asking the question that changes everything? The one who believes when everyone else has already made up their mind? Before we go back and see how this 8-year-old ended up standing in that courtroom, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss how this one ends. Now, let's rewind. To understand how an 8-year-old came to carry his father's whole case on his shoulders, we have to go back 14 months, to a narrow apartment above a laundromat on Miller Street, where the smell of Sunday dinner still meant everything was going to be okay. 14 months earlier, the Carters lived on the second floor above Sudsy's laundromat, on the east side of Ridgeview. The radiator clanked when it ran. The hallway light flickered on its own private schedule. But most evenings, the smell of Renee Carter's smothered chicken drifted under the door before 6 o'clock, and Darnell's laugh usually followed it in by 6:15. Darnell Carter loaded trucks for a living. 11 years at Coldwell Freight and Warehouse, and in all that time, not a single missed shift. His arms were built from it, broad, tired, dependable. The whole block knew those arms. When old Mr. Ainsley's refrigerator gave out, Darnell hauled the new one up 3 flights alone so the man wouldn't have to pay a mover. When the Torres family fell behind on rent, he picked their kids up from school for 2 weeks without being asked twice. "Folks can't always help what they don't have," he liked to say. "But a man can always help." His son Zion was 8 then, small for his age, quiet in a way that made adults forget he was still in the room. But that boy forgot nothing. He read cereal boxes at breakfast. He read the microwave manual twice before anyone else finished it once. He read library books meant for kids twice his age, then read them a second time just to see what he'd missed the first. Every Friday night, father and son kept a ritual. 2 kitchen chairs pulled up to the radiator, 2 mugs of hot cocoa. Darnell would hand Zion an old alarm clock or a broken transistor radio pulled from a neighbor's trash pile and ask, "What's wrong with her?" Zion would turn it over slowly in his hands, listening, feeling for the answer hiding somewhere inside. "A liar's clock still ticks true if you know where to look," Darnell always told him. "You just have to be patient enough to find it. Remember that." It would matter more than anyone on Miller Street could have guessed. "A liar's clock still ticks true if you know where to look," Darnell always told him. "You just have to be patient enough to find it. Remember that." It would matter more than anyone on Miller Street could have guessed. Darnell was 38 that year, built like a man who'd spent a decade proving himself without ever asking for credit. At Coldwell Freight, the younger guys called him Steady Carter, not because he was slow, but because nothing ever seemed to knock him off balance. When someone's kid got sick and they needed their shift covered at the last minute, Darnell was already clocking in before they finished asking. His supervisor, a gruff man named Otis Bell, once told him he was the only loader in the building he never had to double-check. Renee Carter worked nights as a home health aide, driving between 3 different clients across town, an elderly widow with a bad hip, a stroke survivor who liked her to read the newspaper aloud, a retired schoolteacher who mostly just wanted the company. She came home past midnight most nights, quiet as she could manage, and still found a way to leave a lunch packed and labeled on the counter before she left again the next evening. If Darnell was the family's steady hands, Renee was its steady heartbeat, the one who noticed when something was wrong before anyone said a word. And then there was Zion. At 8 years old, he was smaller than most boys his age, easy to overlook in a crowded room. But he forgot nothing. He read the back of the cereal box at breakfast, then read it again to see what he'd missed. He could recite the bus schedule from memory. Once, Renee quizzed him from a warranty booklet just to see if he'd actually absorbed it. He recited the third paragraph word for word, without pausing to think. Every Friday night, the two of them kept their ritual. Darnell would set an old radio or a stopped alarm clock on the kitchen table, pulled from a neighbor's curb, or picked up for $1 at the church rummage sale, and slide it across to his son. "What's wrong with her?" Zion would turn it over slowly, listening for the loose gear, the dead battery hiding behind a battery that looked fine, the thing nobody else had bothered to check. "A liar's clock still ticks true if you know where to look," Darnell said again that night, tapping the cracked face of an old wind-up alarm clock between them. "Most people just believe whatever the numbers tell them. You've got to ask the clock a few more questions first." Neither of them noticed the sirens 2 miles east that same evening, 3 quick blocks past Ridgeview Pharmacy, gone again before anyone thought to wonder why. That night, at 8:12 p.m., a masked man walked into Ridgeview Pharmacy on Route 9, showed a handgun to the clerk behind the counter, and left with $340 from the register. No one was hurt. The whole thing lasted under a minute. The store's security camera caught 12 seconds of grainy footage, a tall man in a dark jacket, broad shoulders, work boots, before he vanished into the parking lot and the dark beyond it. 3 nights later, headlights swept across the Carters' living room window. Zion was at the kitchen table finishing his math homework when the knock came, not a knock exactly, more like the door shaking in its frame. Renee got there first. Her voice cracked the moment she opened it. "What is this about?" 2 officers stood in the stairwell landing outside their apartment, flashlights cutting through the dark hallway. One of them said Darnell's full name like it was a question. Darnell came out from the bedroom in his undershirt, hands already raised before anyone told him to raise them, calm in a way that somehow made it worse. "There's a mistake," he kept saying. "I was at the warehouse that night. Call Coldwell Freight, ask for Otis Bell, he'll tell you. There's a mistake." They walked him down the stairwell to the porch, into the glow of the single working street lamp on Miller Street, and that was where they put the cuffs on, where Mrs. Ainsley could see from her window, where the Torres boys stopped their bikes at the corner to watch, where anyone still awake on the block would remember it for years afterward. Zion stood frozen in the doorway at the top of the stairs, pencil still between his fingers, homework still open on his lap where he'd left it. He didn't cry. He didn't call out. He just watched, the way he watched everything, like he was trying to memorize it in case it mattered later. It would. Darnell turned once before they folded him into the back of the patrol car, his eyes finding his son's through the stairwell railing. He mouthed 4 words, slow enough that Zion could read every one of them through the glass. "I'll be home soon." The car pulled away. The porch light stayed on long after the taillights disappeared around the corner, the way it always did, except this time, no one turned it off, because no one could quite make themselves believe yet that they should. Renee found Zion still standing at the top of the stairs 20 minutes later, homework forgotten, staring at the empty street. "He didn't do it," Zion said. Not a question. Not even really to her. "I know, baby," Renee said, pulling him close. "I know." Neither of them knew yet how long it would take to prove it. Gerald Combs met Darnell for the first time 14 minutes before jury selection. He carried a scuffed leather briefcase held together with packing tape and the particular exhaustion of a man juggling 80-some cases at once. He shook Darnell's hand through the bars of the holding cell, flipped open a manila folder that was thinner than it should have been, and asked him to walk through the night of the robbery one more time, fast, because the bailiff was already calling them in. "I was at the warehouse," Darnell said again, the way he'd said it to 2 officers, 2 detectives, and a bail commissioner. "Ask Otis Bell. Ask anybody on the loading crew." Combs wrote something down. Whether he ever made the call, Darnell would never know for certain. The trial lasted 4 days. It felt shorter than that, and somehow longer. The state's star witness was Walter Pruitt, the pharmacy's owner, a nervous man in his 60s who kept adjusting his glasses on the stand. He said the man who robbed him was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a dark jacket. When the prosecutor asked if he recognized the defendant, Pruitt looked at Darnell for a long moment and said he was fairly sure, the kind of answer that should have unraveled under real cross-examination and instead sailed through untouched. Combs never asked about the store's closing routine. He never requested Coldwell Freight's badge scan records, which sat in a filing cabinet 11 miles away, unopened and unrequested, the whole time. He leaned hardest on reasonable doubt and character witnesses, and it wasn't enough. Around Ridgeview, the town had already cast its verdict weeks before the jury did. At Sunday service, conversations dropped to a hush whenever Renee walked past the fellowship hall. At school, Zion's teachers began speaking to him more gently than usual, the way adults do when they've decided a child is carrying something heavy and don't know how to ask about it directly. The jury took less than 6 hours. Guilty. 14 years. Renee didn't cry in the courtroom. She waited until she was back in the car, engine running, Zion buckled quietly in the back seat, before her shoulders finally gave out. By the following week, she'd picked up weekend cleaning shifts at the medical office downtown, on top of her regular rounds. She came home later. She still packed Zion's lunch every night before she left. Zion sat in his room most evenings after that, homework finished, lights off, staring at the ceiling. He replayed the same fact over and over, turning it in his mind the way his father had taught him to turn an old clock, looking for the loose gear, the thing everyone else had missed. He was at the warehouse that night. Somewhere, there had to be proof of it. He just had to be patient enough to find it. By the time the leaves turned that year, Zion had a routine as fixed as his father's old work schedule. Every afternoon after school, he walked 6 blocks to the Ridgeview Public Library and claimed the same corner table, the one tucked behind the reference stacks where the light from the window lasted longest. He started with what he could understand, basic guides to how courts worked, borrowed from the young readers section at first, then, when those weren't enough, from the adult shelves, where a patient library aide had to explain what half the words meant. Renee filed the request herself, signature shaking slightly, for a full copy of the trial transcript under the state's Open Records Act. It arrived 6 weeks later in a thick envelope that Zion carried home like it was something breakable. He read it front to back once, then started over from the beginning, this time slower, this time with a pencil. He read Walter Pruitt's testimony more times than he could count. Fairly sure. Every place where the prosecutor's question and Pruitt's answer didn't quite line. His system grew without him planning it to. A corkboard Renee found at a yard sale went up on his bedroom wall, index cards pinned in careful rows, witness names, times, contradictions circled in red. A long strip of butcher paper, taped end to end, ran along the baseboard beneath his window, a hand-drawn timeline stretching from 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. on the night of the robbery, hour marked in careful block letters. At the library, a woman named Mrs. Odessa Ferris had started noticing him, the same small boy, same corner table, books on evidence and procedure stacked higher than his own head. She never asked why. She just started leaving things at his table before he arrived, a legal dictionary with tabbed pages, a folder of old newspaper archives on microfiche, once a photocopied guide to reading security camera metadata that she said she found, just lying around, though Zion suspected otherwise. It was on a Tuesday in November, flipping through a printed still from the case file, the same 12-second clip enlarged and grainy, the one the whole trial had rested on, that Zion stopped turning pages. Something in the corner of the frame looked wrong. Not the man in the dark jacket. Not the register, or the door. The clock on the pharmacy wall, half cut off at the edge of the image, small enough that no one testifying had ever mentioned it. Zion pulled the page closer, tilted it toward the window light, and reached for his magnifying glass. The woman had been sitting 2 tables away for weeks before she ever said a word to him. Miriam Halstead came into the Ridgeview Public Library most mornings around 10, always with the same worn leather folio and a thermos of tea, always at the table near the window with the good light. She'd been a defense attorney for 31 years before she retired, though most people in town only knew her as the quiet woman who reads a lot. She'd noticed the boy with the corkboard of index cards weeks ago. She'd assumed, like most adults did, that it was some kind of school project, or a game. That Tuesday, she watched him hunched over a printed photo with a magnifying glass, jaw set in concentration, and finally leaned over. Playing detective? Zion didn't look up right away. No, ma'am. Building a case. Something in the way he said it made her set down her tea. Is that so? She pulled her chair a few inches closer. All right then. What's the standard for admitting new evidence after a conviction? He answered without pausing. Depends on the state, but generally it has to be evidence that wasn't available at trial, and it has to be material, meaning it could have changed the outcome. Miriam blinked. And who bears the burden of proving that? The defense. Ma'am. She sat back slowly, studying him the way she used to study opposing counsel, trying to find the seam, the place where the bluff would show. There wasn't one. What's your name? Zion Carter. And whose case are you building, Zion? My father's. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked to see what he had. He showed her the transcript, the timeline on butcher paper folded up in his backpack, the photo still in his hand. She read for nearly 20 minutes without speaking, and when she finally looked up, her expression had changed entirely. You weren't playing pretend at all, were you? No, ma'am. Then we're going to need to do this properly. If you want a judge to actually listen, this has to be filed the right way, motions, affidavits, all of it. She closed the folder. I can help you with that part. The rest is yours. Zion nodded, and for the first time since she'd sat down, something in his composure slipped, just slightly. What if it's not enough? He asked. What if I find something and it still doesn't matter? Miriam didn't offer him a soft answer. Then you'll have tried harder than anyone else did. That won't fix everything. She held his eyes. But it might be the only chance your father gets. So we don't waste it being afraid. The house was quiet by 10 o'clock, the kind of quiet that only settles in after Renee has finally gone to bed and the radiator has stopped its clanking for the night. Zion sat at his desk under a single lamp, the enlarged printout of the security still spread flat in front of him, magnifying glass in hand. He'd looked at this image 100 times. He made himself look at it again, slower, the way his father taught him to listen to a sick engine, not for what he expected to hear, but for what was actually there. In the top corner of the frame, half cut off by the edge of the shot, hung the pharmacy's wall clock. An old analog model, the kind with real hands instead of numbers. Zion had walked past it in his mind a dozen times without really seeing it. Tonight, he pulled the magnifying glass close and held his breath. The hands read 9:12. The digital timestamp burned into the corner of the same frame read 8:12 p.m. Exactly 1 hour apart. Zion sat back slowly. His pulse was loud in his own ears. He reached for the calendar pinned above his desk, flipping back to March, counting the days until he found it. The robbery had happened 2 nights after daylight saving time began. 2 nights after every clock in Ridgeview was supposed to spring forward an hour. Every clock except one. The pharmacy's security system ran on its own internal clock, the kind that had to be reset by hand. Nobody had touched it. Which meant the timestamp burned into that footage, the one number the entire trial had been built on, was wrong. Not by a little. By exactly 60 minutes. If the robbery hadn't happened at 8:12, it had happened at 9:12. Zion's hands were shaking now as he pulled out the folder Miriam had helped him request weeks earlier, Coldwell Freight's badge scan records, the ones Gerald Combs never bothered to ask for. He found the entry for that night. D. Carter, badge scan, 9:04 p.m. 11 miles from Ridgeview Pharmacy. 8 minutes before the robbery had actually happened. He read it 3 times to make sure it was real. He called Miriam before he let himself think twice about the hour. By morning, she was at the kitchen table with Renee, papers spread between them, drafting the motion for an emergency evidentiary hearing, the kind of filing, she explained, that could reopen a closed case if a judge believed it deserved a second look. Renee read the badge scan record over and over, hope and fear moving across her face in the same breath. If this is real, she whispered, why didn't anyone find it sooner? Miriam didn't look up from her papers. Because nobody thought to ask an 8-year-old for help. The courtroom was full that morning, word having traveled the way it does in a town like Ridgeview, half curiosity, half disbelief that an 8-year-old boy had gotten this far at all. After the exchange with Judge Harrington, after Kellerman's objection had been noted and overruled, the judge folded his hands and looked down at Zion still standing at the podium, the wooden step Miriam had brought from the library propped beneath his feet so he could be seen over the top of it. Mr. Carter, Judge Harrington said, you may proceed. You have one witness and, I'd remind you, one question. Thank you, Your Honor. Walter Pruitt sat in the witness stand, adjusting his glasses the same nervous way he had at the original trial, clearly bracing himself for an attack on the footage, on the timestamp, on everything he'd testified to years before. Zion didn't ask about any of it. Mr. Pruitt, he said, voice steady, what time does your pharmacy lock its front door every night? Pruitt blinked, caught off guard by the ordinariness of the question. 9 o'clock. Sharp. Same time for 11 years. Every night? No exceptions? No exceptions. I set my watch by it, if anything. Zion let the answer sit in the room for a moment, the way his father let a diagnosis settle before naming what was actually wrong. If your door locks at 9 o'clock every night, he said, how could a man have robbed your store at 8:12, a full 48 minutes before it was even supposed to close? The color left Pruitt's face. He opened his mouth. Nothing came. He looked down at his own hands, as though the answer might be written there. I don't, that doesn't. Arthur Kellerman, who had half risen from his chair to object, stopped mid-motion. He looked at Pruitt. He looked at the judge. Then, slowly, without a word, he sat back down. The courtroom that had been rustling with quiet whispers only a moment before went completely, utterly still. No papers shuffling. No coughs. No one in the gallery daring to break whatever had just settled over the room. Judge Harrington leaned forward, studying the witness, then the boy, then the witness again. Mr. Pruitt, he said finally, take your time. But Walter Pruitt didn't say anything at all, not yet. He just sat there, staring at a fact that had lived quietly in his own memory for years, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question and let it out. The silence held. The silence broke first from the witness stand. It was later, Walter Pruitt said quietly, almost to himself. I remember thinking that, even back then, that it felt later than what the report said. I trusted the camera over my own memory. 11 years, I never had a reason not to. He looked up at the gallery, then at Darnell, seated at the defense table with his hands folded in front of him, watching like a man afraid to hope too hard. I'm sorry, Pruitt said. I should have trusted what I felt, not what the screen told me. Judge Harrington turned to Miriam Halstead. Counsel, you may present the remainder of your evidence. Miriam rose and laid it out piece by piece, the badge scan record showing Darnell clocking in 11 miles away at 9:04 p.m., the analog wall clock frozen at 9:12 in the corner of the security still, the daylight saving time records confirming the camera's internal clock had never been reset, and now Pruitt's own restored memory, finally aligned with every other fact in the room. "Every independent record agrees, Your Honor," she said. "The only thing that was ever wrong was the one number the entire case was built on." Judge Harrington was quiet for a long moment, reviewing the documents in front of him. When he finally looked up, his voice was steady and final. "This court finds that the original conviction rested on a timestamp that has since been proven unreliable. The conviction is vacated. Mr. Carter is to be released immediately." The courtroom erupted, not with noise exactly, but with breath, held for months finally let go all at once. Darnell crossed the floor before the bailiff had even finished removing his restraints. He dropped to one knee in the middle of the courtroom and pulled Zion into his arms, holding him the way a man holds something he was afraid he'd never get to hold again. "You found it, son," he said, voice breaking. "You really found it." Zion pressed his face into his father's shoulder and, for the first time in 14 months, let himself just be 8 years old. In the months that followed, Darnell returned to Coldwell Freight, promoted to shift lead at Otis Bell's insistence. Renee gave up her weekend cleaning shifts and started sleeping through most nights again. Miriam kept her Saturday mornings free, and Zion kept showing up at her table at the library, though now they read for the joy of it as often as for a case. Ridgeview Pharmacy's outdated camera system was flagged for review across the whole county. And Zion, mostly, went back to being a kid, though he still read every instruction twice, just to be sure. Every one of us has been told, at some point, to sit down and let the grown-ups handle it. But sometimes the truth doesn't need a law degree, it just needs someone patient enough to keep looking after everyone else has stopped. Darnell always told his son that a liar's clock still ticks true if you know where to look. Maybe that's true for more than just clocks. Maybe it's true for people, too, the ones written off, doubted, underestimated. Look closely enough, ask the right question, and the truth usually finds its way out. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories like this one. And let me know in the comments, what would you have done in Zion's place? Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.